Hisar Foundation and Engro Foundation, in association with TV1, News 1, Wasaib and FM 91, presents the 5th Karachi International Water Conference webinar series on climate change and pandemic impact on water.
I'm Zareen Bakir. I'm a Gender and Natural Resource Management Specialist and also a council member of Hisar Foundation. I'd like to welcome you all to the 5th Karachi International Water Conference on Climate Change and the Pandemic, the Impact on Water, presented by Hisar Foundation. Today is the last webinar of the series, which is on water and climate change, reimagining women's leadership.
The 4 webinars that we have culminated through the webinar series. The first one was Code Red for Humanity, Climate Action Now. The second is Circular Water Economy in Urban Context. The third was Thinking the Unthinkable, Harnessing the Pandemic to Improve SDG 6 Health and Sanitation. And the fourth one that we're gathered here today, Water and Climate Change, Reimagining Women's Leadership.
Climate, COVID, and conflict are going to be the new normal and a game changer on a planet that is warming up rapidly and a world where the population growth rate is exceeding the capacity of the finite resources that sustain life. This imbalance will widen the supply and demand gap, pitting vested interest groups against each other, triggering demographic shifts, and creating new pockets of vulnerability.
Talking about changing women's role in the water sector, as my friend Aisha just mentioned, that change is already happening. Women are actually prepared. They care about things and they are prepared because they have been doing this for centuries. Okay, the day-to-day bag-breaking work, which is what we now require to handle the problems and the climate-related problems, they have done it for centuries. So now they are prepared to live in a climate-changed world. Men are not.
So our next speaker is Fazilda Nabeel, who will be talking about When Women Lead, looking back at eco-feminist movements in history. Fazilda Nabeel is a doctoral researcher and tutor in international development at the University of Sussex. Fazilda, please go ahead. Welcome.
हमारी अगली स्पीकर हैं डॉक्टर फजल्दा नबील, जो कि यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ ससेक्स में रिसर्चर डेवलपमेंट स्टडीज़ हैं। इनका मौजू है जब ख़वातीन क़यादत करती हैं, माजी की माहौलियात पसंद तहरीक पर एक नज़र।
Hi, thank you so much. First of all, I'd just like to begin by thanking Hisar Foundation, particularly Simi Kamal and Sana and Faria, for giving me the opportunity to speak about something that's so close to my heart. So in my talk today, I really want to sort of, to set them apart from the forward-looking talks from both Aisha and Simi. I want to go back in history and explore the role of women in leading efforts for change, drawing inspiration from the famous historical environmental movements led by women, such as, in the case of the Love Canal, the Chipko Movement, the Greenbelt Movement in Kenya, which is more well known. And I want us to be able to draw inspiration from these eco-feminist movements in order to analyze how, or in order to realize how we can bolster women's role for effectively leading climate activism in Pakistan. Building on very many of the things that Simi talked about. So first, before I discuss the 2 stories that I want to discuss, the 2 case studies that I selected for this talk, I would very quickly and very simply, without getting into any dense definitions, I want to simply unpack the idea of what ecofeminism is and why it's relevant. So ecofeminism is both an ideology and a movement that sees climate change, gender equality, and social injustice as related issues. And they're all tied to masculine dominance, male dominance in the society. People who are most affected by environmental destruction, which has been established by studies over and over again, women, particularly indigenous women, who are dependent on their natural environment for subsistence, and also women of color, are are the ones who are best equipped to address the environmental destruction and identify the right solutions. So the idea that, when you're close to the problem, you're essentially also the best person, or you're essentially also the closest to figuring out the solutions, is what really makes the case for, promulgating the role of women as far as climate activism is concerned. Now, with this background, I want to discuss two examples of grassroots activism by women, one of which is from the global south, the Chipko movement, and then the other is from the global north, and then see how we, as locally in Pakistan, the nature of the climate action movement, of climate activism in Pakistan, and how it can draw inspiration from these movements. So the first, the Chipko movement, the Chipko literally just means to embrace, and to embrace a tree, to avoid it from being felled. It was a non-violent movement that started back in 1973 in the Uttarakhand region in India. It is best remembered for collective mobilization of women for the protection of the forest. So what happened was that the forest department in Uttarakhand, it refused to grant permission to these villagers, the local indigenous women and men, to fell ash trees for making agricultural tools. However, instead, the forest department gave permission to a sports good manufacturer, corporate company, to clear that area of land for commercial use. So this was an example of activism by indigenous women who had very little or no training, for this kind of activism, but to whom this resource, the forest trees, were so central. Now, in my next story, or the next little case study that I want to discuss, we'll travel all the way from the forest in northern India to Love Canal, which is a suburban housing society in the Niagara Falls in the 1950s in the United States, and see how working class women at home were able to bring about a phenomenal change when confronted with an ecological crisis. So the Love Canal story is similar but a little different. In this case, in the 1900s, there was an entrepreneur by the name of William Love who began to dig a canal close to the Niagara Falls, to the Niagara River, in fact, in an attempt to use the Niagara Falls water power as a source of renewable energy. But about a couple of years into the construction of the canal, the project was abandoned because it was no longer feasible. Tesla had come up with a better way of harnessing renewable energy in that area. And then this excavated site where the canal was being dug became a dumping site for effluents, both from the city of Niagara Falls, also from the US Army, and then a chemical company which set up. So it had all sorts of about 21,000 tons of chemical waste were deposited over the next 30 years in this excavated site. And it included radioactive waste, it included a dioxin, it included pesticides, caustic solvents. What is worse is, the Hooker Chemical Company, it just simply covered the area. And so after the canal had reached its capacity and it could not take any more effluent, the Hooker Chemical Company simply lined the area with clay, and underneath there were all these caustic effluents in metal barrels, buried underneath. So what happens about 30, 40 years later is that the Niagara Falls School Board was looking for some cheap land, and the Hooker Chemical Company offered this land on which, under which lay that toxic effluent. And the Niagara Falls School Board bought it for $1, simply just $1. And after this, because it was a school that was constructed there in the adjoining area, there was a housing society that was constructed, and everything remained nice and pretty for about 20 years until the residents started having issues. They started complaining of smells in their stench from the basement, chemical stench. They were experiencing, in a particular given year, only about 4 out of 26 births were normal babies, the results were miscarriages or birth defects. So a lot happening in that area. And this is when this stay-at-home mother by the name of Louise Gibbs, she came up and she collected, she realized that there's something deeper going on here, and she collected the women of the area. She formed an association called the Love Canal Homeowners Association, and women got together. They fought for 5 years, and they eventually won. But what do these two movements, the nature of these are kind of different and yet the same. What do these two movements mean for, charting the roadmap for the future women's leadership, climate action in Pakistan? We have seen inspiring examples of women's activism around the world. We've also seen climate activism and women's role, on the front line. For a few years now, there are citizen groups such as Climate Action Now, the Hukuk-e-Khalq movement, the Women and Water networks, such as one run by Hisar Foundation. They all give women a chance to lead and a space to lead climate activism. And this is all very heartening. In Pakistan, the identification of indigenous peoples is tricky. But for instance, the Hindko-speaking people in the Swat and Chitral valleys, the tribal peoples in the Gilgit-Baltistan region, the Saraiki, the Potawari, the tribal people of the Indus, all of these communities and the women in these communities need to be empowered. If we are to, or if we want to truly scale up inclusive and truly and inclusively scale up women's leadership for environmental activism. I think I'll end here, and I'll be open to questions whenever you're ready to take them.
Thank you so much, Fazilda, for such an inspiring presentation.